The first time most people heard the name Augustus Falcone, they were already too afraid to repeat it out loud. At 37, he ran the entire Baltimore waterfront from behind the glass walls of a shipping empire that looked spotless on paper and ran on something far darker underneath. A man with cold gray eyes that never warmed and a reputation that walked into a room a full minute before he did. He didn't raise his voice because he never had to, and the men who'd tried to test him over the years had a way of simply vanishing into the gray water of the Chesapeake. Lainey Wood, 27, had never heard his name in her life. She was too busy surviving. By day, she scrubbed the floors of the grand 6-story townhouse in Federal Hill. Now a cold prison ruled by the stepmother who'd turned her into an unpaid servant the moment her father was lowered into the ground. She knew Thomas Whitlock was her father, but she believed his lies that he had died a bankrupt man, leaving her with nothing. What Lainey didn't know was that her father had hidden a fortune in her real name, Delaney Whitlock, that he'd buried her identity on purpose to keep her safe, and that his death hadn't been an accident at all. She didn't know the cars idling outside the restaurant with their tinted windows weren't there by chance. Her stepmother had stumbled onto the hidden trust files 6 weeks before her 28th birthday, and greed had made her do the unthinkable. She'd sold her own stepdaughter to the wrong kind of men to steal an inheritance that was never hers, and in doing so she'd lit a flare that led a far more dangerous man straight to the girl he'd lost years ago. Because Augustus Falcone had once made a promise to the only person who'd ever saved his life. And when a man like that owes a debt of honor, he doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget, and he most certainly doesn't come quietly. The people who called themselves her family had sold her like a sacrifice. But the man stepping out of the dark was about to make every last one of them pay to bring her home. If you love stories where the broken rise and the cruel finally answer for what they've done, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single chapter. Now let's go back to the night it all began. The night Delaney Whitlock poured herself a cup of tea she'd never get to finish. Steam rose in thick, curling waves from the teacup on the walnut dining table. Delaney had polished 1,000 times, and she stared at it as though it were some strange object inside the very house of her childhood. Priscilla sat at the head of the table, her back perfectly straight, a string of white pearls clasped around her throat, her mouth shaped into a smile. Delaney had never once seen the woman offer her in all those years. The dinner invitation had been strange from the beginning, because Priscilla had never invited her to sit at the same table. She had only ever ordered her to set it, then disappear into the shadows of the kitchen. Tonight was different. Tonight the servants had been sent home early, both the cook and the cleaner, and the 6-story house in Federal Hill felt so vast and so silent that Delaney could hear the beating of her own heart. Devlin and Marlowe sat across from her, the two stepsisters slowly turning their wine glasses in their hands, their eyes fixed on the tabletop, not once lifting to meet hers. It was their silence that sent a cold chill over the back of Delaney's neck. Before coming here, she had received a call from a strange number, Henry Voss, the old attorney who had once worked for her father, the man she had almost forgotten, had called in a trembling voice and repeated the same sentence over and over. "Be careful, Delaney. Whatever happens tonight, you have to be very careful." She hadn't understood. She had meant to call him back and ask him to explain, but Priscilla had urged her to come at once. "Drink, my child," Priscilla said, pushing the teacup toward her, her voice sweet as honey and as false as the powder on her face. "You look so tired. You work so hard, I know you do." The word mother falling from that woman's mouth sounded so wrong that Delaney almost shuddered. She didn't touch the teacup. Something inside her, the same instinct that had helped her survive all those years of being trampled down, was screaming a warning. "What's going on?" Delaney asked, her voice low but not weak. "Why have all the servants gone home? Why are Devlin and Marlowe acting like this?" Priscilla set her wine glass down, the sound of glass against wood sharp and dry. Her smile vanished, replaced by the expression Delaney had seen every time the woman was about to say something cruel. "Your father," Priscilla began, "that foolish Thomas of yours, left behind more than a debt. He borrowed money from a man named Tobias Grant, a great deal of money, and the deadline passed last week." Delaney's heart pounded hard. "How much?" Priscilla shrugged as though she were speaking about the weather. "More than this entire family could gather in 10 lifetimes." Mr. Grant doesn't want money anymore. He said money no longer means anything to him. He wants something else as payment. Marlowe let out a small sob, then quickly covered her mouth. Devlin gripped the stem of her glass so tightly, Delaney thought it might shatter. What are you saying? Delaney stood, her chair scraping harshly across the floor. I have nothing to do with Father's debt. I've paid this family every penny I could from my miserable wages for this past year. Priscilla rose too, slowly, and for the first time that evening, she looked straight into Delaney's eyes with something that was almost pleasure. You will contribute, Delaney. This is the only way you can repay the house that took you in. You've always been a burden. Tonight, for the first time in your life, you'll become useful. A cold wave ran down Delaney's spine as every broken piece began to lock into place inside her mind. Henry Voss's warning, the servants sent away, the avoiding eyes of her two stepsisters, the teacup Priscilla kept insisting she drink. She stepped back once, then again, her trembling hand searching for the edge of the table to steady herself. What have you done? She whispered, her voice breaking. Priscilla, what have you done? Outside, in the still darkness of the wealthiest neighborhood in Baltimore, a deep, dull sound rose through the night, the sound of heavy engines crawling onto the stone-paved street. Devlin finally lifted her head, her face deathly pale, her lips moving as though she wanted to say something, an apology, a warning, but it was already too late. Headlights swept across the tall windows, throwing cold streaks of light over the walls, and then the heavy oak door in the front hall shuddered under a terrifying blow, once, twice, before it burst from its hinges with a splintering crack that tore through the silence of the house. The men poured into the house like a stream of black water, silent and organized, with no shouting, no wasted orders, only the heavy sound of footsteps on the wooden floor Delaney had once polished. They were dressed in dark, precise clothing, their faces emotionless like men who had done this too many times to feel anything anymore. Delaney backed against the wall, her heart hammering wildly, and in that exact moment she realized something horrifying. The room was tilting. The floor seemed to melt beneath her feet. The crystal chandelier blurred into warped halos of light, and her head felt unnaturally heavy. She remembered the sudden movement behind her just as the heavy doors burst open. A large hand clamping a thick, chemical-soaked cloth over her mouth and nose before she could even scream. She had breathed in the sweet, sickly substance deeply, and it was already eating away at her consciousness. It wasn't a family dinner. It was a trap set with care, and she had walked straight into the middle of it. You coward, she staggered, trying to grip the back of a chair, but her hand no longer obeyed her. You caught me off guard, even when I didn't drink. Priscilla only stepped back, drawing the edge of her fur coat away, as though afraid Delaney might touch her with not the slightest trace of guilt in her eyes. From the middle of the men, a tall, thin figure stepped forward, his hair smoothly combed, his coat expensive, his face wearing a courteous smile so cold it chilled the blood. Tobias Grant. He looked at Delaney with the eyes of a man reviewing an account book, then turned to Priscilla, his voice smooth and calm. Mrs. Whitlock, I believe we understand each other. Your husband's debt is erased completely as of tonight. In exchange, should I take her? A leather file was placed on the dining table, right beside the still steaming teacup, and a fountain pen rolled softly across the wood. Priscilla picked up the pen without a second of hesitation, bent over, and signed her name in that familiar, careful handwriting, the same handwriting Delaney had once seen on paychecks, on rejection letters, and even on the paper that had stripped her of her inheritance years ago. Mother Delaney heard her own voice break, thin and distant, as though echoing up from the bottom of a well. Devlin Marlowe, please, you can't let this happen. Please look at me. But Devlin had turned her face toward the wall, her shoulders shaking in waves, and Marlowe covered her face, tears rolling down, yet her feet stayed where they were. No one moved toward Delaney. No one reached out a hand. That betrayal hurt more than the drug eating away at her consciousness, because these were the people who shared her father's blood, the people who had sat with her at this very table since childhood, and now they were choosing silence in exchange for a life without her. Grant checked the signature, nodded in satisfaction, then lightly snapped his fingers. Two men stepped to either side of Delaney. She tried to struggle, tried to scream, but her body was no longer her own. Her legs buckled, and they had to catch her by the arms to keep her from falling face first onto the floor. Don't be afraid, Miss Whitlock, Grant said, his voice so false it was almost gentle. You'll be treated like a valuable piece of merchandise. People always handle expensive things with care. Those words made something inside Delaney's chest go cold, because she understood exactly what she had just become in the eyes of these people. Not a human being, but a number, a payment, a thing to be handed over. She was guided through the hall, past the shattered oak door, lying crooked on the floor, and out into the freezing night, where black cars waited with windows dark as ink. The Baltimore night mist struck her face, and in the last moment she still had consciousness. Delaney turned her head and looked back at the house of her childhood, the place that had once held her father's laughter, the place where she had grown up before it became her prison. The window on the second floor was lit, and behind the glass, she saw Priscilla's figure watching, unmoving, a cold shadow printed against the sickly yellow light. Then a hand settled on her head, pressing her down into the back seat. The car door slammed shut with a sound that cut off every noise from the outside world, and at last the darkness came flooding in, swallowing her whole. Delaney woke to the damp, moldy smell of cold concrete and machine oil, her head still buzzing, as though someone were hammering at her temples. It took a long while for her eyes to adjust to the murky yellow light spilling from the industrial bulbs dangling high overhead, and when she finally saw her surroundings clearly, a fear colder than the night air outside the harbor squeezed the breath from her chest. She was sitting inside a small enclosure divided by steel mesh, one of many compartments lined along the wall of a massive warehouse that had been converted for some hidden purpose. Through the mesh, she saw other women, each one in a separate enclosure. Some had their heads bowed against their knees. Some stared into empty space with eyes in which all hope had gone out. Some were just innocent souls trapped in this nightmare, and seeing them made Delaney's chest tighten. They were all here, all brought to the same place, all turned into the same thing. In the middle of the warehouse was an open patch of floor washed in light, and around it were rows of chairs, where the guests were taking their seats one by one, men and women dressed in expensive clothes, sipping wine from slender glasses, murmuring to one another as though they were attending an auction for paintings or aged wine. But what was being sold here wasn't art. Tobias Grant stepped into the light, holding a folder, his voice carrying through a small microphone with a professionalism so vile it made her stomach turn. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we present special labor contracts, long-term, exclusive, and absolutely discreet. He repeated that phrase, labor contracts, again and again, like a thin coat of paint spread over the naked truth, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. Coercion disguised with paperwork, a human being stripped of the right to be human and given a price. Delaney wanted to vomit. She had once thought things like this existed only in the news, in reports she glanced over and then forgot, in distant statistics about hundreds of thousands of people disappearing every year. She had never imagined she would become one of those numbers, sitting behind a sheet of steel mesh, inside a nameless warehouse on the edge of the city where she had grown up. A man in a gray suit walked along the enclosures, making notes on an electronic tablet, stopping in front of Delaney's compartment and looking her up and down with the empty eyes of someone assigning value, then typing a few lines before moving on. She clenched her hands so tightly her nails dug into her palms, trying to keep herself from falling apart, trying to find anything in that room she could hold on to. There was nothing, only steel walls, cold faces, and the sound of money being spoken of as though it mattered more than human life. When her turn came, two men unlocked the mesh compartment and guided her out into the light. The spotlights shone straight into her face, blinding her, and she heard Grant read aloud the profile he had either invented or dug up, turning her life into a sales pitch. Healthy, educated, no family ties, no one looking for her. That final sentence pierced her heart more deeply than anything else that had happened that night. No one looking for her, because it was true, because the only people who knew where she was were the very people who had brought her here. "We'll begin," Grant announced, his eyes moving across the crowd, at 200,000. A hand rose in the darkness. 250, a voice called out. 300, another sharper voice came from the opposite row. The numbers kept flying back and forth through the stifling air, meaningless, cold, each one another knife cutting into the last of her dignity. Delaney closed her eyes, hot tears sliding down her cheeks, and silently begged for something, anything, a miracle, an ending, a way out. The figure had climbed to nearly 500,000 when it came. A deep, calm voice, not loud at all, yet it cut across the room as sharply as a blade drawn through silk, silencing every whisper, every sip of wine, every sound, leaving behind a silence so thick that Delaney could hear her own heart beating. Enough, that single word fell into the room, like a stone dropped onto the surface of a still lake, and every ripple of greed froze at once. From the far end of the warehouse, where the light did not reach, a man stepped out slowly, one step at a time, and Delaney felt the air change before she could even see his face clearly. The guests who had been calling out prices moments earlier now shrank back in their seats. Some hurried to set down their wine glasses as though they had been caught doing something shameful. Others lowered their heads and didn't dare look up. Tobias Grant, the man who had owned the room only a moment ago, visibly went pale. The man entered the light. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit tailored perfectly to his hard, powerful frame, his hair neatly combed, his face cut with cold, sharp lines as though carved from stone. But what made Delaney hold her breath were his eyes, a cold gray with no warmth in them, eyes that swept once across the room and made every person they passed over give a slight shudder. She had never met this man, she had never heard his name, but she understood at once that this was someone every powerful person in that room feared. "Mr. Falcone," Grant stammered, trying to force out a smile, though it twisted crookedly across his face. "What an unexpected honor. We didn't know you had any interest in tonight's event. If you'd like to participate, I'd be more than happy to offer you a special price." Augustus Falcone did not answer right away. He stopped in the center of the room, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, and when he spoke, his voice remained low and even, yet it carried a weight that seemed to make the entire warehouse fall still. "You know the rules, Grant. Everyone knows the rules. There are things you're allowed to touch, and there are things you aren't." Grant swallowed hard. "I don't understand what you mean." "That woman," Falcone said, his gray eyes settling on Delaney for the first time, and for one brief moment she saw something flicker behind that ice, something she couldn't name. "She belongs to me, and you put your hands on what belongs to me." The whole room fell into a deathly silence. Grant looked toward his men scattered around the warehouse, silently begging for help, but even they were hesitating, because the name Falcone carried a weight no amount of Grant's money could buy enough loyalty to stand against. "Mr. Falcone, there must be some misunderstanding." Grant tried to salvage the moment, his voice beginning to tremble. "She was delivered here completely legally, with full paperwork, with the signature of her guardian." "Her guardian." Falcone repeated the two words with cold contempt. "You call someone who sells their own blood a guardian." He took another step toward Grant, and that single step was enough to make the man retreat. There was no gunshot, no blow, nothing at all except this man's presence, yet everyone in the room cowered as though they stood before something more dangerous than any weapon. Falcone gave the faintest tilt of his head, and his men, shadowed figures Delaney hadn't even realized were already in the room, moved forward silently, surrounding Grant's men with such clean, decisive precision that no one had time to react. In a few short seconds, the balance of power in the room had completely turned, and Tobias Grant, the man who had been selling human lives only moments before, now stood there empty-handed, stripped of everything without a single drop of blood being spilled. Falcone didn't bother to look at him again. He walked toward Delaney, and she instinctively drew back, her spine touching the rope that bound her, her heart pounding, because she didn't know whether she had just been saved or had fallen into the hands of another monster. He lowered himself onto one knee in front of her, level with her eyes, and reached for the rope around her wrists, untying it with movements so slow, so careful, that they seemed strangely impossible for a man the entire room feared. Those gray eyes looked straight into hers, and for the first time in this night of terror, a voice spoke not to command or to buy or to sell, but softly, like a promise. "Don't be afraid of me, Delaney." Exhausted and overwhelmed, the last of her strength gave out, and she let the darkness take her as she collapsed into his arms. When Delaney opened her eyes, the first thing she felt wasn't the damp concrete smell of the warehouse, but the softness of a down comforter and the gentle morning sunlight pouring through tall glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. She jolted upright, her heart beating wildly, and it took a long while before she realized she was lying in a vast bedroom, so luxurious it felt foreign, with dark wood-paneled walls and a window opening onto a view of silver-gray water, stretching all the way to the horizon, Chesapeake Bay. She recognized it by the small fishing boats drifting slowly in the distance and the faint, salty scent in the air. Someone had changed her into clean clothes, a soft cotton nightgown she had never seen before. And the thought that someone had touched her while she was unconscious made her shudder and pull the blanket up over her chest. "You're awake. Thank God." An old voice sounded from the corner of the room, and Delaney startled as she turned. An elderly man sat in a leather armchair, his white hair neatly combed, his eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses looking at her with a tenderness that left her confused. There was something in that face that stirred a vague childhood memory inside her. You're Delaney Whitlock," he said, his voice trembling softly. "You probably don't remember me, but I'm Henry Voss. I used to be your father Thomas's attorney." The name made her freeze. Henry Voss. The man who had called her the night before, the man who had warned her to be careful. "You," she whispered. "You called me. You knew what was going to happen." Mr. Voss lowered his head, and for a moment his eyes avoided hers, settling somewhere on the rug beneath his feet. "I tried to warn you," he said, his voice growing smaller. "But I'm afraid I didn't have time to do more." The unfinished sentence hung suspended in the air, but Delaney was too overwhelmed to dwell on it, because just then the bedroom door opened and the man from the warehouse stepped inside. Augustus Falcone. In daylight he looked even more frightening, not because of his appearance, but because of the absolute stillness that radiated from him, the way he moved without a sound, the way those gray eyes watched her, as though they could read every thought inside her head. She instinctively backed against the headboard. She had heard the name Falcone in passing, enough to understand that she was inside the home of a man all of Baltimore treated with caution, a man whose rescue was almost as terrifying as the danger she had just escaped. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Why did you save me? What do you want from me?" Falcone did not come closer. He stopped in the middle of the room, keeping a distance as though deliberately trying to make her feel safer, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and remote. "You owe me nothing, Miss Whitlock. Don't mistake my taking you out of that place for kindness. I didn't do this for you." The words should have reassured her, but instead they made her chest tighten strangely. "Then why?" she asked. "I'm paying a debt," he replied, his eyes darkening for a fleeting moment. "A very old debt. You only happen to be its price." Delaney looked from Falcone to Mr. Voss, then back to Falcone, growing more confused by the second, because none of those words made any sense to her. She was only a waitress in a restaurant, the daughter of a bankrupt real estate developer. She had nothing valuable enough for anyone to repay a debt with. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm nobody. My father left behind nothing but debt. Why would someone like you have anything to do with me?" Falcone watched her in silence for a long moment, and then he walked to the bedside table and set down something he had been carrying all along. It was an old leather-bound notebook, worn and frayed at the corners, and on the cover, embossed in letters faded by the years, was a name that caught Delaney's breath in her throat. Thomas Whitlock. Delaney stared at the name embossed on that worn old leather cover and did not dare touch it, as though the moment she laid a hand on it, the entire world she had once known would shatter. "That is your father's notebook," Falcone said, his voice softening slightly. "I think it's time you knew the truth about the man you still believed you understood." She looked up, her eyes already bright with tears. "What truth?" "My father was a real estate developer. His business failed. He left behind debts, and then he died in a car accident. That's all I know." Mr. Voss let out a quiet sigh from the corner of the room, a sigh heavy with all the things left unsaid. Falcone drew a chair closer but still kept his distance, sat down, and began speaking in the low, even voice of a man carefully untying each knot of a secret that had been hidden far too long. "Your father wasn't only a real estate developer, Delaney. For many years, he was the most trusted financial manager of powers you can't even imagine. He kept the books. He knew whose money moved where, and more importantly, he controlled a trust, a very large trust, large enough to shift the balance of power across the entire East Coast." Delaney shook her head, unable to believe it. "That's impossible. If my father had that much money, why did we live buried in debt? Why did I have to scrub floors and wait tables to pay it back?" "Because that trust wasn't meant to be spent," Falcone answered. "It was created and placed in the name of one person only, you. Your father arranged for full control of the trust to pass to you on your 28th birthday. 6 weeks from now." The room seemed to tilt beneath Delaney for the second time in less than a day. "Me?" she whispered. Why me? Because you're his daughter by blood, Mr. Voss said from the corner, his voice trembling, and because he trusted you more than anyone else in this world. Falcone nodded, then continued, and this time his voice lowered, careful as though he were crossing dangerous ground. There are people who don't want that trust falling into your hands. There are people who wanted your father to turn it over to them. He refused. He refused until the very end. A frightening silence settled over the room. Delaney felt something icy rising inside her chest, a terrible instinct she did not want to put into words. My father's death, she began, her voice barely there. Are you saying that? It wasn't an accident, Delaney. Falcone looked directly into her eyes as he said it, without looking away, without softening the blow, because he knew she deserved to hear the whole truth. Your father was murdered. That car accident was staged. They killed him because he wouldn't betray you. The tears finally spilled over, sliding down Delaney's cheeks, but strangely, alongside the pain, another feeling was slowly taking shape inside her, a burst of understanding that changed every memory she had of her father. For so many years she had silently blamed him for leaving her with a burden, blamed him for leaving her alone among cruel people, blamed him for not being strong enough to protect her. He hid you, Falcone continued, as though he could read her thoughts. After the trust was created, he knew you would become a target. So he erased your old identity, cut off every connection that could lead anyone to you, and built a life so ordinary that no one would suspect a thing. He turned you into a nobody, not because he didn't love you, but because it was the only way to keep you alive. Delaney covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling in waves, because at last she understood. Her father had not abandoned her. He had died protecting her, and all these years, she had lived inside a lie, built from the very love he had given his life to leave behind. Delaney wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to pull herself out of the pain so she could understand everything fully, because there was still one question she hadn't found an answer to. But why you? She asked, lifting her eyes to Falcone. If my father hid me that well, if no one knew where I was, then why would someone like you even care? You said you're paying a debt. What debt? Falcone was silent for a while, and for the first time since she had met him, something in that cold face seemed to loosen, a shadow from the past passing through his gray eyes. Many years ago, when I was much younger and far more foolish, I found myself in a situation I shouldn't have survived to tell about. I was betrayed, cornered, and I should died that night. Your father was the only one who reached out a hand to me. He owed me nothing. He had no reason to help me, and yet he did. He risked his life and his reputation to save a man this entire city wanted to see lying dead. He paused, his hand tightening faintly where it rested on his knee. Thomas Whitlock was the only person in my entire life who treated me like a human being instead of a monster. And before everything came down on him, I promised him, I swore on my honor, that if anything ever happened to him, I would protect you, the daughter he loved more than his own life. Delaney listened to those words and felt her chest twist painfully, because this was the first time she had ever heard anyone speak of her father with such deep respect. Then she whispered, "Where were you all these years? If you promised to protect me, why did I have to endure all of that alone?" "Because I couldn't find you," Falcone answered, and there was real bitterness in his voice. "Your father did too good a job hiding you. After he died, every trail leading to you disappeared. Your old identity was erased, records were altered, every connection was cut off. I searched for you for years, followed every smallest clue, but he had buried you too deep, so deep that even I, with everything I had, couldn't reach you." He stopped, his eyes turning sharp and cold again. Until 6 weeks ago, Delaney felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened 6 weeks ago, your stepmother," Falcone said, one word at a time, "found the truth. I don't know how. Maybe it was a safe, a document your father didn't have time to destroy, but she discovered who you were, and she discovered the trust that was about to pass into your hands. The moment she began asking questions, began contacting men like Tobias Grant, was the moment the name Delaney Whitlock rose back to the surface. Her greed did the very thing your father died trying to prevent. It revealed your location, and this time, I found you before it was too late." The final pieces came together in Delaney's mind, and along with that understanding, a new emotion rose inside her. No longer fear, no longer the resignation that had weighed on her for so many years. Priscilla hadn't sold her to pay off her father's debt. She had sold her to steal the fortune that belonged to her. to erase her before that fateful birthday, to turn her into a missing woman while she calmly seized everything. That woman had been ready to push her into hell for nothing but greed. A hot flame began to burn inside Delaney's chest, a clean and righteous fury she had never allowed herself to feel before. She slowly lifted her head, and this time, when Augustus Falcone's cold gray eyes looked at her, she did not look away. It took several days before Delaney began to grow, used to the rhythm of life in the mansion by the bay, to the vast silence of its long corridors, and the ever-present awareness that Augustus Falcone was somewhere nearby, a man she still did not know whether to fear or trust. It was during those days that Mr. Henry Voss became the only anchor she could hold on to, the only person in this house who carried a warmth that reminded her of her father. He often sat with her beside the window overlooking the water, telling her small stories about Thomas when he was young, and each story felt like it was stitching one torn piece of her heart back together. But that morning, when Mr. Voss entered the room, his face was entirely different. His shoulders seemed to sag beneath an invisible weight, and in his hand he held an envelope yellowed by the years. "There is something I need to give you," he said, his voice gone hoarse. "I've kept it for many years. I should given it to you sooner, but I didn't have enough courage." He placed the envelope on the table in front of her, and his hand was trembling so badly she could see it. "This is what I gathered after your father died. I never believed it was an accident, so I quietly looked into it." Delaney opened the envelope with shaking fingers and took out a stack of old papers. There were copies of her father's travel schedule during his final days, pages of messy notes, and hidden photographs of meetings where she did not recognize anyone. "I don't understand all of this," Mr. Voss continued, his eyes once again avoiding hers, settling on the tabletop instead of looking into her face. "But there is one thing I know for certain. On the day your father died, whoever caused it knew exactly where he would be, at what time, and which road he would take. His schedule was always kept absolutely secret. Even I didn't always know it, and yet they knew. They knew everything." A cold silence settled over the room as the meaning of those words sank into Delaney. "You're saying," she said slowly, "that someone tipped them off. Someone close to my father betrayed him." Mr. Voss nodded, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple, even though the room wasn't warm. "An inside man, Delaney. Someone very close. Someone your father trusted enough to share secrets he didn't share with anyone else. That's the only way they could have struck so cleanly." Delaney felt her stomach twist. She turned through the pages one by one, trying to find a name, a sign, anything that might reveal who had pushed her father toward his death. Her hands moved faster, her heart beat harder, and then, from between the papers, a small photograph slipped free, fluttered unsteadily through the air, and landed on the floor. She bent down and picked it up. It was an old photograph, slightly blurred, showing her father standing in front of a building she did not recognize, and beside him, with one hand resting on his shoulder in the familiar manner of an old friend, stood a man. A face that something inside her instantly recognized as familiar, a face she had seen somewhere recently, but her mind was spinning so wildly that she couldn't connect it to a name. She frowned, bringing the photograph closer beneath the light, and a sense of unease slipped into her heart like a breath of cold air, because the longer she looked, the more certain she became that she had seen those eyes, that smile, somewhere very close to the present Mr. Voss. She asked, lifting her head, her voice dropping low, "Who is this man?" But when she turned, she saw Mr. Henry Voss staring at the photograph in her hand, his face drained of every trace of blood. Mr. Voss hurried away with a promise that he would look further into the photograph, leaving Delaney alone with an unanswered question and a sense of unease that clung to her for the rest of that day. When night fell, she couldn't sleep at all, so she put on a coat and went downstairs, following the dim corridors of the mansion until she saw a strip of light spilling from the half-open door of the library. Inside, Augustus Falcone was standing beside the large window, overlooking the dark bay, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, and in the firelight, his face looked entirely different, no longer carrying the absolute coldness of daylight, but marked by a deep loneliness he did not bother to hide when he thought no one was watching. "You can't sleep either?" Delaney spoke softly from the doorway. He did not startle. He only tilted his head slightly, as though he had known she was there all along. "I rarely sleep," he replied. "Not for a long time." She stepped inside, keeping a safe distance, and sat down in the armchair near the fireplace. There was something about the stillness of the night that made it easier for both of them to speak, as though the darkness itself were a sheltering curtain. My father once told me, she began, that the people who have the hardest time sleeping are usually the ones carrying the heaviest things in their hearts. Falcone was silent for a long while, and Delaney thought he would not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and distant. I wasn't always the man you see now. There was a time when I had a family too, a home, people I loved. He took a sip of whiskey, his eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Then one night, everything was taken from me. During a purge between men fighting for power, the people I loved paid the price for something they had never been part of. I was the only one who survived. I was 16 years old. Delaney slowly lifted a hand to cover her mouth, the pain in his voice making her chest tighten. I'm so sorry, she whispered, and she said it with all the sincerity she had. He turned to look at her, and in those gray eyes there was a flicker of surprise, as though it had been far too long since anyone had offered him a kind word without fear or calculation attached to it. You don't need to feel sorry for me, he said. I became what I had to become in order to survive. I learned that kindness will get you killed in the world where I grew up. That the only way to never lose anything again is to never let yourself care about anything. I built walls, and I became very good at making people afraid. But you kept your promise to my father, Delaney said gently. A man who no longer cares about anything wouldn't spend years searching for a strange girl only because of an oath. You can tell yourself you're only repaying a debt, but I don't believe a truly cold man would kneel down and untie a stranger as carefully as you did. Falcone looked at her for a long time, and for the first time since she had met him, the man who always knew exactly what to say and what to do could find no words to answer. Something in the way she looked at him, not with the fear the rest of the world always gave him, but with a gentle understanding, had touched someplace deep inside him that he had believed had gone numb long ago. He opened his mouth as though to say something, then stopped, and in that rare moment of hesitation, the ice that had wrapped around him for so many years cracked along one small, quiet line. You should go to sleep, Delaney, he finally said. But his voice had softened, and she understood that it wasn't an attempt to send her away, but the voice of a man frightened by the very things he was beginning to feel. The next morning, for the first time in days, Delaney felt her heart grow a little lighter. The night before, as she lay awake, turning restlessly beneath the covers, she had thought about Ginny, her only friend at the harborfront restaurant, a woman of 30, who always secretly slipped her the leftover bread at the end of a shift, always stood up for her whenever the manager scolded her unfairly, the woman who had once held her hand on a rainy night and told her that someday things would get better. Delaney had thought that when all of this was over, the first thing she would do would be to find Ginny, hold her tightly, and thank her for being the only light in the darkest days. But that peaceful morning shattered when the telephone in her room began to ring. An unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then picked it up, and the voice that came through the other end of the line turned the blood in her body cold. Hello, Miss Whitlock. I believe you still remember me, Tobias Grant. His voice was still courteous, still cold, but this time it carried a note of triumph that made her sick. I have to admit, Mr. Falcone ruined what would have been a very profitable evening for me. But I'm not a man who ever walks away empty-handed, and I've just discovered that you have a very charming weakness. Delaney's heart pounded. What do you want? I have a friend of yours here, Grant said, and then his voice drifted farther away as though he were turning the phone in another direction. Then, Ginny's trembling, terrified voice broke through the line. Lane? Lane, is that you? Delaney's entire world collapsed. Don't listen to them. Don't do anything for me. The sentence was cut off, and Grant returned with a tone so casual it was cruel. As you can see, she's fine, for now. I have no interest in hurting innocent women who waits tables for a living. But that depends entirely on you. Delaney gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. What do you want? She repeated, her voice barely there. The trust, Grant answered, no longer bothering to circle around it. On your birthday, control of it will pass to you. You'll sign it all over to me. It's that simple. You do as I say, and your friend goes home safely. You tell Falcone, or do anything foolish, and I can't make any promises about her safety. You have 3 days to think about it. The line went dead. Delaney stood there with the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the steady beeping echo through the empty space, and then her legs gave way. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, covered her face with both hands, and the tears spilled out before she could stop them. Ginny had nothing to do with any of this. Ginny was only a kind woman who had shown her goodness when no one else had, and now that very kindness had turned her into a hostage in a war she had never even known existed. Guilt pressed down on Delaney's chest until she could barely breathe. She could hand over the trust, surrender the inheritance her father had died to protect, in exchange for Ginny's life. But she knew men like Grant. She had seen his true nature in that warehouse that night, and some deep instinct inside her told her that no matter what she did, a man like him would never keep his word. She sat there for a long time in the sun-filled room, torn between fear and friendship, between the choice to run and the choice to face what was coming. And then, from the deepest place inside that despair, she remembered her father, the man who had never bowed, no matter that the price had been his own life. She remembered the flame of fury that had begun to burn inside her a few days before. Delaney wiped her tears, and this time she did not wipe them away in weakness. She stood, both feet steady on the floor, and in her eyes there was no longer the fear of prey, but the iron resolve of someone who had chosen never to run again. Delaney found Augustus Falcone in his study, and this time she did not knock timidly. She walked straight in with her father's leather-bound notebook tucked tightly under her arm. He looked up from the stack of documents on his desk, and from one glance at her face, he knew something had changed. "Grant called me," she said directly, without circling around it. "He has Ginny, my friend. He wants me to sign the entire trust over to him, or he'll hurt her." Falcone's gray eyes darkened, and she saw his hands tighten on the desktop. "He dared," he said, his voice dropping into something dangerous. "He's just signed his own death warrant. I'll find out where he is, and I'll end this in the only way men like him understand." He rose about to walk out, but Delaney stepped in front of him. "No," she said, and the firmness in her voice made him stop. "If you charge in and kill him, what do you think will happen to Ginny? You don't even know where she's being held. If he has guards with orders to act when something goes wrong, then your temper will get her killed before you can reach her." Falcone looked at her, and for one moment she saw the irritation of a man who wasn't used to being stopped. "Then what do you want me to do? Sit still and let him threaten you." Delaney opened her father's notebook and placed it on the desk, its pages crowded with numbers, diagrams of money trails, and notes written in Thomas's familiar hand. "I want you to let me use what my father left me. I've been reading this notebook over the past few days. I don't understand all of it, but I understand enough. My father didn't just hold money for people. He understood how money moves, how it leaves traces, how people can be trapped by their own greed. Grant wants the trust. Then we'll let him see that he's about to get it." Falcone frowned, but this time he did not interrupt her. He was listening. "We'll set a financial trap," she continued, her voice growing steadier as she realized her mind was working in exactly the way her father had once taught her when she was a child. Through games with numbers she had thought were only a pastime back then. We let him believe the transfer is already in motion. He'll have to show himself to receive it. He'll have to bring Ginny out to complete the exchange. And that's when we act. But you have to do it my way." She lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes. "When this is over, I don't want you to kill him." Falcone looked at her as though she had spoken a language he did not understand. "That man sold you like merchandise. He kidnapped your friend, and you want me to spare him." "I didn't say spare him," Delaney answered, not backing down at all. "I said don't kill him. There's a very great difference. You told me you became what you needed to become in order to survive, that you made people afraid. But killing Grant in some dark warehouse only makes him disappear, and another man will take his place next week. That isn't strength. That's only the same circle repeating itself, the same circle that killed your family and killed my father. Real strength, Augustus, is dragging him into the light, making him pay in a way he can't escape with money or fists, ending his operation so no other woman ever has to sit behind that steel mesh again." Falcone stood in silence for a long time, his gray eyes fixed on her face, and Delaney could see a struggle unfolding inside this man, between the ruthless instinct that had been carved into him through his entire life and something new that she herself had awakened. For so many years, he had solved every problem with fear and violence, and no one had ever dared stand in front of him and say there was another way. And then, slowly, the man all of Baltimore feared, the man who had never listened to anyone throughout his lonely life, gave a slight nod. The plan began to take shape over the following hours, and Falcone summoned his most trusted man to prepare, a man named Benedict Faulkner who had stood beside him for many years, the right hand to whom he entrusted his most important secrets. Delaney had met Faulkner a few times inside the mansion, a man around 40 with a courteous smile and eyes that were always watching, and she did not understand why every time she was near him, she felt a vague unease. That night, when she went to find Falcone to discuss the plan further, she heard his voice coming from the study, low and cold enough to make her stop outside the door. She looked in through the narrow opening and saw him standing alone, the computer screen in front of him filled with recordings of phone calls, copies of transfer statements, and a series of documents she could not read from a distance. But she could read his face, and what she saw there made her shudder, an icy fury rising behind the mask of calm. She stepped inside. What happened? Falcone did not turn around at once. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and even in a frightening way. For years, someone has been leaking my information to the outside. I've suspected it for a long time, but I couldn't find proof. Until tonight. He turned the screen toward her, and Delaney saw a photograph, a time-stamped recording, a flow of money moving from Tobias Grant's account into an intermediary account. Benedict Faulkner, the man I trusted more than anyone. He sold information to Grant. He was the one who told Grant I had an interest in you, and there's more. He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked with an emotion she had never heard from him before. The name in these old transactions, these contacts from years ago, they lead back to the night your father was murdered. Faulkner was one of the links. He was involved in it from the beginning. Delaney felt the whole world sway. The man who had still walked through this very house, who had still sat at the same dining table with them, had been part of the machinery that killed her father. She saw Falcone reach for his coat, his eyes already shifting into a deadly shade of gray, and she knew exactly what he meant to do. He meant to go after Faulkner that very night and end everything in the old bloody way he had known his entire life. She rushed forward and placed her hand on his arm. Augustus, stop. The muscle beneath her hand was tense as steel, and for a moment she thought he would shake her off. Let go of me, Delaney, he said, his voice choked with rage. This man betrayed me. He helped kill your father. He doesn't deserve mercy. I know, she answered, and she did not let go, did not retreat from the anger boiling inside him. I'm so angry I can barely breathe too. But think. If you kill Faulkner now, you'll lose the only path leading to Grant, to Ginny, to the whole truth. Faulkner doesn't know you've discovered him. Do you understand what that means? It means he still thinks he's safe. It means he's still feeding information to Grant. We can use him to send the exact information we want Grant to believe. He'll become his own trap without ever knowing it. Falcone stood motionless, his breathing heavy, and she could feel the war taking place inside him, between the hunger for immediate revenge and the cold wisdom she had just placed in his hands. Each passing second stretched endlessly. Then slowly she felt the arm beneath her hand loosen, the rigid muscle gradually easing, and when he turned to look at her, the fury in his eyes had been forced down, not gone, but hidden behind a layer of ice even more terrifying, the calculating calm of a predator who had just changed tactics. Fine, he said softly, we'll do it your way. Faulkner will dig his own grave. And in that cold gaze, Delaney saw a plan beginning to take shape. Sealed tight and more dangerous than any burst of rage, the plan was completed in that study when the night had already grown late. They would let Faulkner accidentally overhear that the transfer of the trust was being pushed forward, that Delaney would personally appear at a warehouse on the harbor to complete the exchange with Grant, trading herself for Ginny. Faulkner would pass that information to Grant, believing he was helping him set a trap, when in truth he was leading Grant into the trap Falcone had already prepared. Every detail was calculated with care. They mapped out every entrance and exit, every position where Falcone's men would hide, and every backup plan in case something went wrong. Delaney listened, memorized, and contributed things only someone who understood the movement of money could have thought of, and Falcone, a man who had never truly discussed a plan with anyone, but had only issued commands, realized that he was listening to her in a way he had never listened to anyone else. When everything had been settled, a tired but peaceful silence covered the room. Delaney leaned back in her chair, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that was about to happen. Do you think we'll succeed? She asked softly. Falcone sat down in the chair across from her, closer than usual. I don't promise things I'm not certain of, he said. But I promise you this. Whatever happens in that warehouse, I won't let anyone touch you. I swore to your father, but now I'm saying this for a reason beyond that oath. Delaney lifted her eyes, and their gazes met in the fading firelight. Something had changed between them over the past few days. Something they both felt, but neither of them dared to name. She had come into this house as trembling prey, afraid of the man who had rescued her almost as much as she was afraid of the people who had sold her away. But now, when she looked into those gray eyes, she no longer saw fear. She saw a lonely man who had forgotten what it felt like to be trusted by someone, and she realized that she, too, had forgotten what it felt like to trust anyone. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Augustus, she said, and it was the truth. I used to think you were another monster in a night full of monsters. But I was wrong. You're the only one who didn't abandon me. Something flashed in his eyes, an emotion he had buried for so long that he almost no longer recognized it. He lifted his hand, hesitated for a moment, then gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, a strangely tender gesture from hands that the entire city feared. You shouldn't put your faith in a man like me, he said quietly, but his voice lacked the certainty of a real warning. Perhaps, Delaney answered, not pulling away from his touch. But I still do. And I promise you something too, Augustus. When all of this is over, you won't have to be alone anymore. He looked at her for a long time, and in that moment, the man who had spent 20 years building walls around his heart felt them crack once more, deeper than ever before. They sat together in the stillness, needing no words, two people carrying wounds that looked so much alike, finally finding in each other something they had both believed was lost long ago, a place to belong. When the first rays of dawn began to slip through the window, staining Chesapeake Bay with a cold silver gray, they both knew the day they had been waiting for had come. In the distance, the harbor slowly emerged through the morning mist, silent and waiting, and somewhere inside its dark warehouses, the fate of all of them was about to be decided. The warehouse stood at the farthest edge of the harbor, a rusted block of steel, rising out of the evening mist, and when the car carrying Delaney stopped in front of its doors, her heart was pounding so hard she thought the whole world could hear it. She stepped out alone, exactly as planned, her slender figure standing in the vast empty yard. But she was not alone at all. In the darkness of the stacked containers, along the rooftops of the neighboring warehouses, Falcone's men had been in place for hours, invisible and motionless, and he himself was somewhere very close, watching every step she took. Tobias Grant emerged from the warehouse door, that familiar courteous smile on his lips, and behind him, flanked by two men, was Ginny. Her friend looked worn and frightened, but when their eyes met, Delaney saw that she was still whole, and part of the weight in her chest lifted. You came alone, just as I asked, Grant said, his voice carrying through the open space. I have to commend you for being sensible. Mr. Falcone's friend Faulkner was very useful in confirming that. That sentence was exactly what Delaney and Falcone had been waiting for. Proof that the trap had closed just as they had calculated, that Faulkner had swallowed the false information whole and passed it to Grant, leading him here with the belief that he was the one in control. I brought what you wanted, Delaney said, raising the briefcase in her hand. Let Ginny go first, then I'll sign. Grant gave a mocking laugh. Do you think I was born yesterday? You sign first, then she leaves. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a figure stepped out from behind Grant, and Delaney recognized Benedict Faulkner, his face still wearing the confidence of a man who believed he was standing on the winning side. Everything has been checked. There's no sign of Falcone's men, Faulkner told Grant. She really came alone. And that was the moment the familiar, deep, cold voice rose from the darkness, cutting through the air like a blade. Are you sure, Benedict? Augustus Falcone stepped out from the shadows of the containers, and Delaney saw Faulkner's face collapse, his confidence dissolving into horror as he realized that all this time he had been the one being led. Mr. Faulkner stammered, but there were no words left for him to say. You served me for many years, Falcone said, his voice not loud, yet heavy as stone, and through all those years, you sold me away piece by piece. You thought I didn't know. You thought you were smarter than me. In the chaos of the moment when Grant realized he had been outmaneuvered, everything happened very quickly. Falcone's men surged in from every direction, surrounding the warehouse with clean, decisive precision, and Grant's men, overwhelmed in both number and position, quickly understood that resistance was pointless. Delaney only heard a few brief sounds, a few shouted orders, and then everything settled with astonishing speed. She ran to Ginny the moment the two guards released her, wrapping her arms tightly around her friend, and the two of them broke down crying in the freezing yard. "You really came," Ginny sobbed. "I thought I'd never see you again." "I was never going to let that happen," Delaney whispered, holding her even tighter. When she lifted her head, she saw Tobias Grant restrained, both hands held firmly behind his back, and for the first time since she had met him, his face no longer carried that courteous smile, only the naked defeat of a man who had just lost everything. One of Falcone's men stepped forward and placed something in his hands, something they had taken from Grant's office during the confusion, a thick file of records, lists, and dark evidence of the entire human trafficking operation he had run for so many years. Falcone took it, turned through a few pages, and a cold light sharpened in his gray eyes. This was not merely the fall of one man. This was the key to ending everything. When Grant was escorted into the middle of the yard, another figure was brought forward by Falcone's men from one of the idling cars, slowly, shoulders heavy and sagging, and Delaney froze when she recognized Henry Voss. She did not understand why he was here, why he wasn't safe back at the mansion, until she saw his face. A face wet with tears and marked by a pain that had clung to him for so long it seemed carved into every line. "Mr. Voss," she called, her voice confused. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Voss stopped a few steps away from her, and he could not lift his head to look at her. "I came to tell you the truth, Delaney," he said, his voice breaking. "The truth I was too much of a coward to tell you for all these years. The photograph the other day, the man standing beside your father, it was me. I was the inside man." The whole world seemed to stop around Delaney. She stepped back, shaking her head. "No, you warned me. You gave me the files. You told me stories about my father. Because I was trying to atone for what I'd done." Mr. Voss sobbed. "Many years ago, Grant found leverage over me, an old mistake, a secret that would have destroyed my entire family if it came to light. He threatened my wife, my children. He forced me to give him your father's schedule. I thought I was only handing over a few pieces of paper. I lied to myself that nothing would happen. But then your father died, and I understood that I had killed him, the only friend who had ever been kind to me. I've lived with that guilt every day since. When I learned you were still alive, I swore I would do everything I could to protect you, to make up for even a fraction of what I had done." Delaney stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, and inside her was a tangled storm of emotions tearing against one another: betrayal, grief, pity, and a rage that did not know where to go. The man standing before her was both the one who had helped kill her father and the one who had risked himself to save her. Augustus Falcone stepped up beside her, and in his hand was a gun. He did not point it at anyone. Instead, he slowly placed it in Delaney's palm, and her fingers instinctively closed around the ice-cold metal. "This man was involved in your father's death," Falcone said quietly, his voice neither urging nor judging, only setting the truth before her. "Grant is standing there too. Both men who ruined your life are here right in front of you. All my life I've handled moments like this in only one way. But this isn't my life, this is yours. And the choice is yours, Delaney, yours alone." The entire harbor yard fell into absolute silence. Falcone's men stood motionless. Tobias Grant stopped struggling, and Henry Voss closed his eyes, not begging, only waiting quietly for the judgment he believed he deserved. Delaney looked down at the gun in her hand, feeling its weight, the weight of a choice that could define the person she would become. In that moment, so many images flooded her mind: her father's gentle face, the nights she had cried alone in a cold room, the flame of fury that had begun to burn when she learned the truth. She could pull the trigger. She could pour all the pain of the years she had been trampled into this single moment, could make the men who had stolen everything from her pay in blood. Her hand trembled, her finger tightening around the grip, and the whole world held its breath, waiting to see what the girl who had once been sold like merchandise would do now that the power over life and death was finally in her hands. But as she looked into the weeping eyes of Henry Voss and the pathetic, defeated face of Tobias Grant, Delaney slowly lowered the weapon. She turned back to Falcone, her voice shaking, but filled with an unyielding strength, as she told him that taking their lives would only make her no different from the monsters who had ruined hers, and that she chose to let the law strip them of everything instead. Falcone nodded in silent respect, gesturing for his men to hand the criminals over to the waiting authorities, before guiding her back to the car to settle the final debt. The townhouse in Federal Hill was blazing with light when Falcone's car stopped outside, and through the tall windows, Delaney could see Priscilla inside, raising a glass with her 2 daughters beside a lavishly set dinner table. Classical music drifted out, along with soft laughter and warm golden light, all of it creating a scene of triumph, as though nothing had happened, as though they had completely forgotten the girl they had pushed into darkness only a few weeks before. Delaney stepped into the house of her childhood, this time not as a trembling servant, but with her spine straight and her gaze unwavering. The dining room door opened, and the 3 women turned. The champagne glass in Priscilla's hand fell and shattered across the wooden floor. "Impossible," she whispered, her face turning white. You were sold. Grant took you away." "Grant is on his way to federal prison," Delaney answered, her voice terrifyingly calm, "along with all the evidence of what he's done. And what you've done." Devlin and Marlowe sat frozen in their chairs, their eyes wide as they stared at the sister they had turned their backs on, and on their faces, Delaney saw not triumph but shame and fear. Priscilla, cornered at last, began to show her true self. "Delaney, darling, you have to understand me," she stammered, changing her tone with dizzying speed. "I had no other choice. The debt, the pressure, I was forced. I never wanted to hurt you." "Don't," Delaney cut in, and that single word was enough to silence Priscilla. "Don't call me darling. You sold me so you could steal what belonged to me. You knew exactly what you were doing." Priscilla looked around in desperation, and then, in her panic, she did something that froze the entire room. She pointed a shaking finger toward her 2 daughters. "If you need someone to punish, then take them," she cried out in a shrill voice. "Devlin and Marlowe, they're young, they're worth far more than I am. I'll sign anything, just spare me." A horrific silence fell. Devlin burst into tears, while Marlowe looked at her mother with the eyes of someone who had just watched something break beyond repair. "Mother," Marlowe whispered, her voice cracking, "what did you just say?" Delaney looked at the woman who had tormented her for so many years, the woman who was now ready to sell her own flesh and blood to save herself, and what she felt was not anger, but a cold pity. "Do you see," she said quietly, "this is who you really are. I was never the cruel one in this house. It was never me." She placed a stack of documents on the table, legal papers prepared by Henry Voss and Falcone's attorneys. "Every asset in this house, every account, everything you stole, originally belonged to my father, and now legally belongs to me. I'm taking it all back. As for your role in selling a human being and embezzling my property, the authorities already have all the evidence they need. You'll face the law, Priscilla. Not with fists, but through the very system you thought you could use." Then she turned to her 2 stepsisters, and her voice softened. "As for you," she said, "you turned your backs on me. I won't forget that. But I also just watched you discover who your mother really is. I won't drag you down with her. You'll have to stand on your own feet, earn your own living, and rebuild from the beginning without this fortune. That is your chance to become better people than the ones you were taught to be." When Delaney turned and walked out, leaving Priscilla standing stunned in the middle of the ruined dining room, among broken glass and yellow light that now felt hollow and chilling, she did not look back. The woman who had once ruled this house was now only a lonely shadow among the ashes of her own greed, and as the door closed behind Delaney, it carried away an entire chapter of her life that she could finally lay down. 6 months had passed since that fateful night at the harbor, and spring had returned to the shores of Chesapeake Bay, bringing warm sunlight and a peace Delaney had never dared to dream of. She stood inside a bright building in downtown Baltimore, where a newly hung sign bore the words, Thomas Whitlock Foundation, an organization she had built from the very fortune her father had died to protect, devoted to rescuing and supporting victims of human trafficking, people who had once been treated like merchandise just as she had been. She had come to understand that the greatest inheritance her father left her wasn't money, but the chance to turn her pain into light for others. Ginny stood beside her, healed in both body and spirit, now the director of the Foundation's support program, and her smile was brighter than ever. The women who had once sat behind the steel mesh in that warehouse on that night had all been rescued because of the file handed over to the authorities, and many of them were now beginning their lives again with the Foundation's help. Tobias Grant and Benedict Faulkner were awaiting trial and facing severe sentences, while Henry Voss, after giving his full testimony, had chosen to spend the years he had left atoning by working quietly for the Foundation. And Delaney, though she still couldn't forget everything, had learned that forgiveness wasn't always for the other person, but a way to free her own heart from the weight of hatred. Augustus Falcone had changed in ways even he had never expected. The man who had once believed the world respected only fear now stood quietly behind Delaney, watching her with a tenderness no one had ever thought a man like him could possess. He had begun dismantling pieces of the shadow empire he had built, turning it toward legal paths, not because anyone forced him to, but because for the first time in his life, he had a reason to want to become a better man. That evening, as the two of them stood together on the balcony, looking out over the bay gilded by the sunset, he took her hand. "I told you I saved you because of a debt," he said softly. "But that hasn't been true for a long time. I stayed not because of my oath to your father. I stayed because of you, Delaney. Because you showed me that even a man like me could still be redeemed." Delaney rested her head against his shoulder, and in that moment, two people who had carried the deepest wounds, who had once been the loneliest souls in their own worlds, finally found a place to belong, not in power or revenge, but in a love that had healed them both. The girl who had once been sold, like merchandise, now stood firmly on her own 2 feet, not because anyone had granted her that strength, but because of the kindness and resilience she had never lost. The story of Delaney Whitlock reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity can never truly be bought or sold, that our worth does not lie in what others think of us or in what we possess, but in the goodness we are still able to keep even in the darkest hours. True strength isn't the ability to destroy our enemies, but the courage to choose mercy when revenge would be easier, to choose justice instead of hatred, to turn our own pain into hope for others. And sometimes, love and kindness are the very things powerful enough to soften even hearts that seem to have turned to stone. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can listen together to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Delaney and Augustus? Do you think she made the right choice when she chose justice instead of revenge? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always eager to listen to your voice. Thank you for spending your time watching until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.